Okay, let's get this out of the way. Sonic the Hedgehog is cool. I feel like if this series didn't imprint onto you as a young child, you'll never understand why we love the dude. But just know that even through the worst hardships, his fans will stand by him. Except when that hardship is a fighting game, apparently. I put out a tweet asking for examples of games that have had their reputation unfairly harmed due to ignorant reviews, and was honestly surprised to see how many people replied with Sonic the Fighters, which is a goofy little fighting game released in the arcades by the legendary Sega Am2 team. Growing up, my friends and I loved playing it on the Sonic Gems collection, so I figured everyone just thought it was a goofy, harmless spin-off game. But after getting all of these replies, I decided to go through a ton of forum posts, reviews, and videos about the game myself. And yeah, a lot of people online legitimately think this game is bad, but for very shallow reasons in my opinion. And this is because I feel like most critiques online for Sonic the Fighters comes from general Sonic fans who aren't necessarily the biggest fighting game enjoyers. I've seen way too many videos online complaining about how the story is bad or how you can just spam one move to win in arcade mode. And respectfully, those are points that have no bearing on my enjoyment for the genre. But I know that fighting games are niche and are often misunderstood by more casual audiences. So that's why I was inspired to take a deeper look from a fighting game fan's perspective, to see what Sonic the Fighters really offers. Of course, we gotta set the stage with a history lesson of what led to Sonic the Fighters. So let's start with its developer, Sega AM Research and Development No. 2, more commonly known as Sega Am2, which was a development team within Sega, spearheaded by the legendary Yu Suzuki, that was known for pushing the boundaries of what games could be in the arcades. Space Harrier, Afterburner, Outrun, and all came from this team, and the importance of these games might be lost on younger viewers, or those not in tune with arcade culture. But every Sega Am2 release was a Game Center milestone that blew its contemporaries out of the water. While in the West, Sega's brand was synonymous with Sonic and its consoles, Sega of Japan was primarily known for the grip it had in the arcades, which culminated in 1993 with the release of Sega Am2's Virtua Fighter. And I really can't understate how big of a deal Virtua Fighter was in Japan. It was a genuine video game phenomenon. But while the series did well and has always been respected in the West, Virtua Fighter sadly never really became a part of the cultural zeitgeist like Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, or Tekken did here. So Sega decided to make Fighting Vipers, another 3D fighter that uses Virtua Fighter 2's engine that was made to appeal more to Western gamers by replacing the graceful martial arts of Virtua Fighter with flashy fighting full of ridiculous 90s attitude. Yeah, Fighting Vipers was basically Gonzo Virtua Fighter for Americans, but for some reason, even this didn't catch on here, and again, was just more popular in Japan. I guess we just didn't have the 3D fighter Sega brainworms that Japan did. But more importantly for us right now, the less serious attitude for Fighting Vipers seemed to let Sega Am2 be more experimental and have some fun with the development, cause not only is the gameplay a lot more wild than base Virtua Fighter, there's also a goofy array of hidden characters within the game, like Kuma-chan and Pepsi Man in the Saturn port, and hidden away in the arcade version were fighter versions of the actual development team for the game, and yeah, Sonic and Tails. These two were supposedly put in Fighting Vipers as a joke by Am2 character designer Masahiro Sugiyama, which led to Yu Suzuki finding out about the secret fighting animals and showing it to then president of Am2, Hiroshi Katoka, who apparently liked it so much that he then presented it to Sonic co-creator himself, Yuji Naka, as the basis for a potential Sonic the Hedgehog fighter. And surprisingly, even Yuji Naka thought it was cool. So the project went forward, and a year later in 1996, what started off as a bored gag actually hit the arcades. Sonic the Fighters is a 3D fighting game developed for the legendary Sega Model 2 arcade hardware that uses a modified version of the Fighting Vipers engine, which itself was a modified version of the Virtua Fighter 2 engine. But before we even get into the gameplay, I just want to stop and appreciate how incredible this game is graphically. Model 2 games have aged pretty gracefully compared to its contemporaries in my opinion, despite the hardware being 30 years old at this point. But it's just super impressive to me just how well Sonic and Friends actually look and animate, especially considering that this was the franchise's first official time being fully modeled out for a true 3D game. Sonic the Fighters captures the Sonic cast perfectly, with a semi-chibi style that fits the Genesis era of the franchise. Everyone here is just full of expression, and the way that the characters are allowed to actually be cartoons, who squash and stretch and get wild with their proportions, is incredibly charming and fitting. It's legitimately just awesome and smooth animation that makes this game feel timeless to me, like some old Looney Tunes. Which means I get to say that Sonic actually had a pretty cool transition to 3D, right? Anyways, I also love the stages in this game, cause they're super varied in terms of locale and aesthetic. We of course got Green Hill, but there's also Mushroom Hill Zone that always makes me feel super nostalgic. Casino Night is here, there's a flying carpet stage with Sonic pyramids in the background. And then there's my absolute favorite stage, the Aurora Ice Field, which is just peak mid-90s early 3D bliss. And the song for the stage is one of my favorite fighting game songs ever. To no one's surprise, Sonic the Fighters is a 3-button game, just like Virtua Fighter and Fighting Vipers, with the same punch and kick buttons, but instead of a normal guard for the 3rd button, you have a barrier button that a lot of the game's depth comes from, so we'll come back to that in a bit. Attacks are done in the form of short commands, strings, and surprisingly even motions, like Sonic's got a legit command grab here. While you're not going to find crazy Tekken juggles here, Sonic the Fighters is still much more loose than early Virtua Fighter, and even Fighting Vipers, cause every character gets access to launchers, jumping is a lot more offensive, there are strong OTGs, and everyone gets unique stuff like spin dashes, glides, or even bombs and guns. Check out this zoning. And the walls of the stage don't just act like a corner here either, cause you can get wall bounces off of them in all kinds of different ways. And characters even have unique moves off them too. With attacks generally being bigger and taking up new realms of space, it also makes sense that Sonic the Fighters was the first AM2 fighting game to finally introduce sidestepping as well. Which is good defensively, but can also be used offensively if you're right next to someone to open them up. And it can even break a stock of your opponent's barrier. And yeah, I said stock. Defending is kinda unique in this game. So instead of just holding down guard and having to block high or low, Sonic the Fighter simplifies but also complicates guarding, because you have a barrier that blocks all incoming attacks, but also has a limited number of stocks that can be used. Blocking certain strings or attacks will destroy a stock, and while you can't really be punished for your barrier breaking, those stocks don't come back for the rest of the match. Yeah, I said the match, not the round, and matches are best of 5 in this game. So, guarding is incredibly committal. This gives Sonic the Fighters a very interesting dynamic that forces the player to pace when it's actually worth blocking, or better to just take the hit. Or, you could just not care about blocking at all, and use a stock of your barrier to go into hyper mode, which makes all of your attacks recover super fast in exchange for less damage, setting up really nasty strike throw situations in the process. There are also air techs and rolls to get yourself out of situations, but like any good 3D fighter, this just means that there are crazy Oki situations, and sometimes you just mess up and gotta eat something dirty. Compared to Virtua Fighter 2 and Fighting Vipers, I'd say that Sonic the Fighters thankfully has a fittingly fast pace. Because the characters are so short and stubby, mobility is important, and you're forced to get right up next to the opponent to really get stuff started. But look, I'm not here to lie and say that Sonic the Fighters matches the depth of something like Virtua Fighter 5, 4, or even 3. By design, the game was made to be simple and appeal to kids, cause, you know, it's based on Sonic. So I guess this kinda makes Sonic the Fighters the real Virtua Fighter kids. But, with the mobility and barrier system the game has, I honestly don't think it's incomparable to its early 3D fighter contemporaries. In fact, I think it's aged better than a lot of early 3D fighters that don't nearly get the same amount of negativity thrown at them. Because at the end of the day, Sonic the Fighters is fluid, responsive, and buttons just feel good to press. Which I can't say for a lot of 3D fighters that came out in 1996. And none of this should come as a surprise, because this game wasn't made by rookies. It was made by one of the most critically acclaimed teams of the 90s, who had one of the biggest fighting games ever under their belt. But beyond all that, let's take a look at the rest of the game. The game is about Sonic and pals holding a tournament to see who is worthy of going up to space to beat up Eggman at his Death Egg colony, which kinda rules. You of course got Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, and classic Sega CD Amy, but the rest of the cast is filled up by more niche critters, like Espio, who was fresh out of Knuckles Chaotix at this point. I always found it weird how Vector wasn't in this, but the Ninja Chameleon was definitely a great choice for the time. There's also Fang the Sniper, who's from the Game Gear game Sonic Triple Trouble, and I really like this dude's design honestly, so I'm glad he's making a return in Sonic Superstars. Plus, he's got a gun, so that's pretty cool, and slightly annoying. But even cooler is that you can take his gun away and shoot him in the face. Then you got Bean the Dynamite, who is a woodpecker with bombs. Growing up, I hated this dude, and still kinda do. He's actually from one of AM2's first games, called Dynamite Ducks. Which is weird cause he is a woodpecker, but apparently his parents are ducks. Yeah, I don't know. Sega calls him a dynamite, whatever that means. Next we got Bark the Polar Bear, and this dude rules. He's the big body who's super slow, but hits extremely hard. Dude is so big he can't even crouch. Growing up, I loved him because he reminded me of Alex from Street Fighter 3. I can't be the only one who thought that, right? He's my number one wasted character in the entire Sonic franchise. He should be in the main Sonic posse, please. And then you got the boss characters Metal Sonic and Eggman, who weren't actually playable until the PS3 and 360 release of the game in 2012, along with the character Honey the Cat, who's basically a Sonic OC version of the character Honey from Fighting Vipers. So it's kinda like a cool full circle moment, having her hidden and playable in Sonic the Fighters. Honey is also unsurprisingly probably the most popular export from this game, and just begs the question why Sega hasn't just made more of their characters into Sonic OCs, cause I think that idea would just print money. I'd make a Guile Sonic OC myself to try and cash in on this, but I remember that Sonic actually met Guile canonically in the Archie comics, and he was thoroughly unimpressed with his Sonic boom. We really need a Sega vs Capcom game to settle this, don't we? But anyways, you beat everyone up, take their Chaos Emeralds, and go to space to fight Eggman. This final round would always stress me out as a kid, cause you have to finish it within a short time limit or you don't get the actual ending. But if you're playing as Sonic and you don't lose any rounds, you can turn into Super Sonic and beat it easily. And that's the game. Interestingly enough, Sonic the Fighters has a small but active community that's still keeping the game alive through the HD re-release and through online emulation. What's cool to me is that a bulk of these players exist outside of the usual fighting game community and are mostly made up of Sonic fans who've seen the light. I hope Sega is willing to re-release the 2012 HD remaster at some point, because this game is annoyingly inaccessible. Model 2 games can be hard to emulate, it never got a port on the Saturn or Dreamcast like it should've, the Sonic Gems collection that introduced most of us to this game has terrible input lag, and the HD remasters are over 10 years old at this point. But at the same time, they are definitely more important fighters Sega needs to bring back before this. While Sega AM2 never made a sequel to Sonic the Fighters, Bean and Bark did show up in Fighters Mega Mix, which was basically the Sega AM2 crossover fighter that lets you beat up a woodpecker with a car. Yeah, bro retired and started playing soccer after this. The only other official Sonic fighting game came from Sega in 2003 with the GBA title Sonic Battle. Growing up, this game was in rotation with Battle Network as the go-to game to fight your friends in after Saturday morning cartoons were over. It's aight. There's also tons of fan-made Sonic fighting games too, and some of them are legitimately incredible. I'll have to talk about them more sometime. But there's still a charm to the OG Sonic fighters. This game along with Sonic R just make me feel comfy if I'm being honest. So, if you're interested, I definitely check it out with an open mind, and hopefully, you'll find more than you thought you would. Cause seriously, let's not think we know more than the great Sega AM2, okay? Thanks!